Hello everybody, and welcome to, I believe, the third video in what I have created as, at least for the videos that I'm creating this week's endgame solving lesson. So I've made two other videos this week, one on endgame Zugzwang, using Zugzwang in the endgame, one on some pretty common rook endgames and ideas in those endgames, and today we're going to be focusing on 5 opposite colored bishop endgames. So I just sort of decided, I haven't covered that many endgames, and it's just, I think they're very interesting, and it's good to get a range of different endgame ideas. Of course, endgames are super important, and as you work on your endgames, you get much better. And of course, endgames also come in many different forms. So obviously, this is my third video in this week's series on different types of endgames, but it is not just these 3 types of endgames. Of course, there are so many. This is just another example. And this video, which covers opposite color bishop endgames, will not even begin to touch every single type of opposite color bishop endgame. It'll give you some great ideas, but it will not cover everything. So, first of all, before we start solving, let's talk about opposite color bishop endgames. First of all, if you do not know what an opposite color bishop endgame is, it is when, obviously, you've reached the endgame position, and you each have one bishop, and they are, not that they are opposite colors, black versus white, but that the squares they are on are opposite colors. So this is a light squared bishop, and this is a dark squared bishop, and that is the main difference. So if this was a light squared bishop, this bishop was on d7, this would not be an opposite color bishop endgame. It would be a same color bishop endgame, and it's a different story. Why? Well, because when you have two opposite color bishops and an opposite color bishop endgame, it means that they are controlling different squares. This bishop is controlling all of these light squares. If it moves here, it controls all of these, right? If it moves here, it controls all of these. This bishop controls all the dark squares, so on and so forth, if we just moved around. So what is the point? It is because these pieces will never be able to capture one another. They are controlling different squares, so this kind of battle to control squares, but not the same squares, often results in opposite color bishop endgames being a draw, because it is so hard to get the upper hand when you're fighting over different squares. Because oftentimes we'll have key squares in an endgame that once you get control of it, you can get the upper hand. Much harder and much more confusing and complex in an opposite color bishop endgame, because one side will control maybe a light squared key square and the other side controls a dark squared key square, and you can't really fight over them because you have no pieces to do that with. So maybe this is still confusing, but we are going to get into it. So here it is black to move. It looks like white is winning here. They are planning to play pawn g6. After we take, they'll play h7. Our light squared bishop is not going to be able to stop h8. So what do we have to do? We have to stop this g6 move, okay? So we're going to play bishop h5, immediately stopping g6. Now the king is headed for our e4 pawn, okay? Another issue. But we are going to stay on this g6 square by just moving onto it. Now this pawn cannot promote. We are guarding e4 as a square. This king is never going to be able to disrupt the bishop whatsoever. Let's do an analysis for 1 second just to talk about some other ideas that are part of the position. Hopefully it loads. Okay. 1 second. Okay, not working. Anyways, the point is, we are just going to end up moving this king back and forth, probably on c8 and b7. This king can make no progress. So, this is an example of an opposite color bishop endgame draw, okay? No one can make progress. If this king tries to make its way over to c6, first of all, it's going to have a hard time doing that because our king's on b7, but we can always tuck our bishop back to e8 and stop c6. So a key square white wants to get to, they're not able to. Maybe black wants to try and take this b6 pawn. They can't. It's on a dark square. This light square bishop can't do anything. That is why opposite color bishop endgames are often a draw. Not always, but oftentimes, especially when there's almost an equal amount of pawns. Alright, our second puzzle touches on a very interesting idea, and that is pass pawns when it is a bishop and a pawn and a king versus a king. Pass pawns, on the h file or the a file, okay? So, first off, we're going to attack this pawn on g4. That's very important. And the reason is because here we can actually take that pawn, which may seem very confusing, very peculiar. Alright, so for some reason the analysis is not working, but we can still talk about it. So, the important thing to notice about this endgame, this is a dark squared bishop, and this pawn is promoting to a light square. So, if you have an outside pass pawn, and the king is in front of it, the king has to be in front of the pawn. So pawn on the h file or the a file, and the promoting square is a different colored square from the only bishop on the board, it is going to be a draw because black still cannot avoid stalemate. If this pawn was on a4 and the king was on a2, it would be a win for black, okay? They will be able to promote this pawn because a1 is a dark square and c5 is a dark square. If it was a white bishop on the board and it was on a dark square, you can only promote if your outside pass pawn is going to h8, and if it was a light colored white bishop, it can only promote if it's going to a8. Alright, let us continue. This puzzle is a bit more, it's a bit different. Obviously, we have rooks on the board, so we are trying to use ideas. Since we have a different colored bishop, we have a light square bishop instead of a dark square bishop. This is about taking advantage of the squares that white cannot control. In this case, if we look at the squares around this king, there are not many, okay? So, what is the idea that we have to use? Well, first of all, we want to try and do a checkmate. And what squares can black not control? These light squares around the king. So d3 was the only remaining square that white had in this position, as we saw. We cover d3. Even though we are abandoning e4 at this point, it is okay, because if they played a move like rook a6, rook e2 is going to cover e4, and this would be checkmate. So d5 is the only way to get out of checkmate, in large part, because this bishop cannot challenge these light squares, okay? Or it cannot challenge this pawn, which is also doing an important job covering these squares if the king decided to move up. And that is because they're opposite colored bishops. So d5 is the only choice, but we're not going to let them out. We're not just going to go for the pawn. We will play e5, okay? Now we are covering all the escape squares, and this is a forced mate because white, again, has no possible way to stop the control of these light squares. It is over for white. Rook e2 will be checkmate. This is also, I guess you could call it a zugzwang position. No good moves. No move at all is a good move because no moves are going to stop what is coming. All right. Our fourth puzzle is another drawing situation. So, what is the challenge? We are white to move, and these pawns are about to promote to our queen. Our pawn has a long way to go, or at least much longer than these two pawns, and we need to stop them. What's important to notice is, again, opposite colored bishops. Sorry about the arrow. Opposite colored bishops, and that these squares that they're promoting to, or the square that they're going to next, are light squares. So we need to get on one of these diagonals, preferably this diagonal right here, because it would cover both squares. How are we going to do that? We are going to give a check with pawn f6. King takes. Now we have opened ourselves up to play bishop g4. If you don't know, this will now be a draw again. A very common opposite colored bishop endgame draw, because this king is going to march over to c2, march over to d1, and this bishop is just going to hop back and forth between e2, f3, g4, and h5. As long as it is not captured, it is impossible for black to make progress. If they push e2, we will just take it. Again, because these bishops are controlling different squares. That is the whole point, guys. Hopefully we're getting that by this point. Okay, white to move. Now we are trying to win. Alright, this is about, sometimes, like I said, we have opposite colored bishop endgames where an uneven amount of pawns, especially when, like we saw in our earlier puzzle, it's not a pawn on the outside with the wrong colored piece. So it would be much different if this pawn was off the board. Yes, it would be much different if this pawn was off the board, because then black would just sacrifice on h7. Our pawns are going this way, if you haven't noticed. But the point being, we can overpower this bishop by this point. So, how are we going to do that? We have two pawns that we can promote, and the bishop is attacking both squares, but it is not going to be able to keep track of both at the exact same time. So, first we play pawn c6. We'll notice if this bishop takes on c6, h7, no way to stop that h8 promotion, and if it just goes back to attack h7, we will just promote. So, the bishop must move, waste a little bit of time. Now, we can play c7, okay? We are trying to promote to c8. It will stop c8, and how can we find the win here? We are just going to threaten to promote on the other side as well. Bishop is overpowered. It's got nothing to do. If it stays over here, then we're going to promote. And once it takes, we can just promote to a queen, and we have won this game, okay? So, a couple ideas tangled up in this opposite colored bishop endgame. I'm sorry if there are cars going by that are making a little disrupting noise. First of all, opposite colored bishop endgames, like I talked about, they're different. The bishops are occupying completely different squares, so it is hard to challenge control, and it is hard to make progress often, and that means there are often draws. When you cannot make a lot of progress in an endgame because you simply cannot get to certain squares, cannot move your pawns at all, or they'll be taken, it often means positions are a draw. Does that mean every opposite colored bishop endgame? Obviously not. We just saw this one here. Another very important theme that I'd like to point out is this idea that we saw right here. This idea that an colored bishop, right, or when it has traded down to an outside pawn on the H file or A file. Remember, guys, if this pawn is on G, F, E, D, C, or B, and there's an extra bishop on the board, it is going to be a win, unless this king is so far away and the pawn is, on the wrong square and the king is right next to it. But that's a very specific circumstance. If this pawn is on the H file or A file, and the opposing king has gotten in front of it, meaning it is in the way of that promoting square, if the promoting square is not the same color square as the square that the bishop is on, and will remain on for the whole game, because bishops cannot change from dark squares to light squares, if that promoting square is a different color, it is going to be a draw, okay? If that promoting square is the same color, if this pawn was on the A file, that is going to be a win, okay? So, those are the key ideas. Opposite color bishop endgames are important to know about. First of all, they are good to know how to draw if you are in a worse position and need to get a draw. Second of all, they are often important in games when thinking about going to the endgame and progressing towards an endgame by trading. If you are trying to win a game, you have a winning position, maybe you're up one pawn or even two pawns, and your plan is to trade down, but you realize you're going to have opposite colored bishops, it doesn't mean you'll necessarily get a draw guaranteed, but it means you should take some time and think about that position. Will that opposite color bishop endgame still be winnable for you? Or is it a better idea to hold on to those extra pieces that you have and maybe trade off to a less often balanced endgame? So if you have, let's say, two bishops and a bishop of one opposite color and a knight, there are situations where maybe it's a better idea to trade the bishops of the same color off, and then it is bishop versus knight. And then if you're up two pawns or you're up one pawn, it can be easier. Obviously, I'm kind of talking hypotheticals here, but I hope you guys know what I mean. I hope this was a useful video. Opposite color bishop endgames, guys, they are more common than you think, and they are very confusing. So practice them out. See if you see them in your games. Take your time when you get to them because they can be even trickier than this. And I hope to see how that goes for you guys. So I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.